Hi, welcome to FLYTcast off the cuff. This episode is about the basic definition of a cult. What is a cult? I'm Jen Cotton, pronoun she, her, and today we're just going to get into some real basics. We've talked a little bit about some of the models, some of the specific principles of how cults work, and over the course of that, we've talked about what a cult is, but I thought it would be good to just have a brief definitional segment, that I can refer people to, so that you can have context for the rest of the principles that we talk about. Um, so, what is a cult? What is a cult? There is a myth that there's no real academic consensus for what a cult is. This kind of drives me nuts. You look at all kinds of media articles that are written about cults, or you look at um, even documentaries that happen sometimes, and they're well intentioned, but for whatever reason they perpetuate this myth, this idea that there's no academic consensus as to what a cult is. It's very clear. Um, all of the different researchers agree that a cult is a psychologically manipulative group. A psychologically manipulative group. That's all a cult is. And this has been our video. Well, we'll go a little bit farther than that. Um, I think that the reason that they say there's no academic consensus, which is false, the reason they're probably getting that impression is because there's lots of different ways of describing cults, of measuring cults, kind of like there's different maps that can describe the same territory. Different maps may even disagree about certain details of the territory. So think of the town where you live. You go to a gas station, uh, and you pick up a map there, or at a hotel. And actually, a hotel's a better example. Let's go to a hotel, because there's going to be a rack there with a whole bunch of different maps on it, all with different purposes. Some of them are going to be road maps, of just your town. Some are going to be maps of the state. Some are going to be, what are the local attractions? What are the local restaurants? Those sorts of things. If you pick a map up from that rack, you could have your normal map that says, here's how to get around town. You could also have a map there that says, here's all the different restaurants in town. That doesn't mean that those two maps are at odds as to what territory they're describing. Probably they're going to have the same bounds and describe the same streets, but just for different purposes. Now, let's just say you go up the street and there is a Forest Service building, and you go in and you want some maps for hiking. Those maps are going to describe some of the same territory as well, but they might have show the hiking trails, or have a topographic map, show the topography of how high and how low things are. There might be a map as to what the different nature reserves in the area are. You could get a BLM map, Bureau of Land Management, on what the public lands are. Tells you what activities are and are not appropriate on different lands, depending on what the laws are. So all of these maps can describe the same territory, or highly overlapping territory. They dice it up differently. They parse out the information differently, but they're describing the same thing. And it's the same with cult researchers. It's a myth that there's no academic consensus about what a cult is. They're just describing different aspects of the same thing. I think it's kind of a dangerous myth to say that there's no real understanding of what a cult is, because that makes it really easy for cults and cult-like behaviors to slide under the radar. I was there's a saying of one man's cult is another man's truth, and it's like, no. If it's a cult, it's a cult. The guy who's in the cult just thinks it's true. A cult is defined by control, by toxic behaviors. It's a psychologically manipulative group. Okay, so a cult can be any sort of group, any sort of human organization that has those behaviors present. Um, another myth. I'm gonna go actually a few myths here. I'm gonna open up because this also drives me nuts. Uh, I'm gonna look up in the dictionary what a cult is. Cult definition. Typing into my computer here. I feel here kind of like, so my normal career. So I'm kind of a science communicator and cult activist on the side, but my primary career is I'm a scientific illustrator and exhibit designer for museums, particularly with dinosaurs. And anybody who studies dinosaurs will tell you that the media gets it wrong all the time, and you get really frustrated watching documentaries, excited to see the dinosaurs, but they misinterpret things all the time, not intentionally, but they really mess things up and confuse the public. And the same is true around cults the more that you dig into it. So I'm going to open up cult meaning on. Let's go with Cambridge. That's a venerable sounding dictionary, right? Okay, so this is really bad. It says cult, a religious group often living together whose beliefs are considered extreme or strange by many people. That's not what a cult is. A cult can have those attributes, but that's not what defines it. A cult isn't defined by whether its beliefs are considered strange or extreme. That's kind of a relativistic definition. There's, the much more concrete definition of a cult is a psychologically manipulative group, a group that uses coercive psychological tactics to force people to do and believe things that they wouldn't of their own free will. So there's kind of this weird sense in the general public that a cult's just weird people. That's not what it is. If you were to take some person from the modern era, any person at random, just take your average guy, average all of your standard milk toast 9 to 5 job white collar guys together, guy who doesn't believe anything relatively weird to our time. Now send him back to the era of the Salem witch trials, and if he started sharing some of his beliefs, some of the things that we've discovered since then, about the universe, about evolution, about physics, about those sorts of things, people there would think he was crazy. They'd think he was pretty weird. They'd think he was a witch. They'd burn him at the stake or do what have you to him. That doesn't mean that he was in a cult. So let's break this down real quick, because I think there's a couple of myths rolled into this that are going to help us know what a cult is. We've kind of given the basic definition, and I'm going to repeat this a few times just so that it's kind of in your head really, really clearly. I apologize if this gets repetitive or pedantic, but it's this, cult is a psychologically manipulative group. Here in Cambridge, and I'm picking on Cambridge, but you'll see this in a lot of dictionaries. It's very poorly defined. I'm seeing some more recently kind of catch up to the academic research, but this is a good example of a poor example. Cult, it says, a religious group often living together whose beliefs are considered extreme or strange by many people. First part, a religious group. A cult can be a religious group, but that's only one kind of cult. See, not all religious groups are cults, but a religious group that is psychologically manipulative is a cult. Again, back to that definition. So, religions are only one kind of group of people. Any group can be a cult if it becomes psychologically manipulative. A club can become a cult. A fraternity or sorority can become a cult. That doesn't mean they all are. You can have a very healthy one, but if it has toxic behaviors going on and psychological manipulation and warping people's sense of reality through psychologically coercive tactics, then it's a cult. If it doesn't do any of those things, then it's not a cult. You can have a cult that is a business. Um, You'll hear cult experts talk a lot about MLMs, multi-level marketings, things like Lularoe or Mary Kay, or any of these other ones. I apologize, my voice is getting kind of hoarse. Funny thing, I recorded this whole thing once before I started, but the microphone was off. So I'm doing this twice, so it's getting hard on my voice. You can have a religious cult, you can have a business cult. Again, if that group is using psychologically coercive tactics, to the degree that it's doing that, it's a cult. There's a spectrum. You can have a political cult, a group rallying around a leader or ideas that cause people to manipulate each other and control each other's will. You can have a cult built around any type of group of people. As I list these things, I want you to know, I'm not saying that any of these things are inherently a cult. It's just that these attributes can pop up in any sort of human organization. Take a drink here. All right. You can have cults in athletic groups. You can have cults in martial arts groups. That's been a thing. If they start to revere their sensei in a particular way. I grew up in the martial arts. I love the martial arts. I've seen a number of groups kind of get to that point where, whether it's a living or dead founder that they really start to dogmatically revere, almost like a religious leader, and then start to treat each other unkindly whenever any sort of divergent thinking arises. That sort of thing develops into a cult. You can have cults that are based in anything really. So, the next part. So religious group often living together. Living together, it can be. I mentioned earlier there's different models of cult control. The Lifton's 8 criteria, which is one of the best models, describes something called milieu control. Milieu is your environment, everything around you, from like the physical surroundings of, the building that you're living in, to the social interactions that are available to you, to the information that's available to you. That's the milieu, the environment. And cults work very hard to control those things because, just like your brain's just like a computer. If you can control the input, you control the output. So cults very often will have strict rules about what sort of information is okay to take in. This is why, in political cults like North Korea, they try to maintain a strict control over the internet and who has access to it and how much of it. There are actually really high penalties for a person being discovered. There's kind of a black market there of people smuggling in little USB data sticks with television entertainment movies from around the world, pirated movies. You get caught with Seinfeld on a data stick, you can get sent off to a camp there because they don't want information coming from the outside. And a lot of the people who have escaped said that, it kind of started with their seeing that, we're told here that this is the best life that you can possibly have, that we have it so much better than everywhere else, that we should feel so lucky. But then we see this footage of people all over the world who have more freedom, have a higher standard of living. We didn't know life could be that good. And they start yearning for something more. And that's a big part of why they try to control the information so much. Lifton, who came up with this idea of milieu control, he in this model, he came up with it studying a political cult, namely the Chinese Communist Party, during the Korean War, during and after the Korean War. He was an Air Force psychologist, who took an interest in some of the symptoms of the soldiers coming back from the prisoner camps with the Chinese involvement in that war, and he gleaned from their experiences and those of various victims who had escaped to Hong Kong, Chinese nationals and others, that there were 8 principles that their experiences had in common that were used to, control their minds. And one of those things is milieu control. You control the input, you control the output. Now, the examples I've used for this sort of information control of preventing, people from accessing a milieu of information outside of the cult. We've talked about North Korea and China either cutting off the internet or preventing people from accessing the broader global internet by creating their own. That's a really extreme example. But there's a spectrum, you could have the cult that says, you live in this compound, you can only access things that are on this compound. You could say, the cult doesn't live on a compound, but you're not allowed to watch TV. You could say the cult doesn't live on a compound, but you're only allowed to watch certain types of TV. You're only allowed to watch certain types of movies. And there's a variation in extremity of that too. You could say, okay, they can't watch R-rated movies. Some get more extreme. You could say, like Jehovah's Witnesses, they say you can't watch any movie that has any portrayal of magic, including animals talking. That's magic, that's witchcraft, and you can't watch it. All these sorts of control of the media that people consume. Most commonly, though, and this is, the most common and most potent aspect of media information control, it's this idea of saying that you can't listen to anybody who has anything critical to say about the group or its leaders, because the leaders are inspired or they have this ultimate truth. Then anybody who disagrees with them has to be wrong, has to be lying. And it's inappropriate or even spiritually damaging to listen to any criticisms, however legitimate, of the group. Anybody on the outside is out to get you, so don't read stuff outside that hasn't been approved by the central authority. That's really the core of the information control. There are some things that are quirky, like don't watch talking animals, don't watch R-rated movies, but it's more damaging to say either, prohibit through the rules, limiting, you can't study what anybody else has to say about the group, or, limiting that through stigma. If you study this, then you're getting into dangerous territory. If you entertain any potential ideas or sympathize with anybody who has criticisms of the group, then you're less faithful. So there's a spectrum of that as well. So I've kind of gone on a tangent there, but where it says in the Cambridge Dictionary, a religious group often living together, not all cults live together, but living together is a great way to control the milieu, control the environment. So frequently, there will be compounds, particularly in the early stages of a cult. There will be compounds like Waco, Texas, where the Branch Davidians stole away to and hid from the rest of the world, gathering their weapons before the showdown with the FBI back in the 90s. There was the compound of Jonestown in Guyana, that whole situation. If the leader controls the environment, the tighter control they have on the environment, the tighter control that they have on the people. Input has a great control over output. That's why many of them live together. You see this in the early times of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's early on, the people would gather together. This is the group that I grew up in, by the way. 150 years ago, the members of the religion lived on their own. They would go and build cities. It was primarily just them living there. They were persecuted and awful things happened to them, so that they stuck together. So that was part of it. but it was also part of it, the environment control. Eventually, they left to Utah, where I presently live, and they built various cities and compounds here away from governmental control, but also because of the fact that it was only the religious group living out here, they had massive control over the laws and over the environment. And even though Utah has become part of the United States since then, the church still has massive sway in the government here. It's the only cult that, for all intents and purposes, owns a U.S. state. There's lots of other people living here, but they've probably got the biggest sway of any political group in the state. It's environmental control that has evolved. Now, I think the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a great way to show how that can change over time. I'll probably do another video about that because, eventually it started with everybody living together, and then they started spreading out more. They started chilling out more. Cults tend to do that over time. The strictness tends to erode, at least in certain areas, as they assimilate with the rest of society. And so, although members of the church still continue to have very tight-knit communities wherever they're located, they're more integrated with other areas of society. They still say that they are in the world but not of the world, and they try to work hard to maintain distinction both externally and in their thinking from the way that the rest of the world thinks, but they don't directly live together so much anymore. So yeah, living together is something that happens, but it's and something that can be used to increase control, but it's not something that happens in every case. For instance, you see the cult of QAnon that has been sweeping the United States and the world by storm. This is a cult that defies a lot of our standard thinking about cults. They don't live together, but they congregate together digitally on these social media platforms and these echo chambers, and it creates many of these same social dynamics as if the people were living in the same compound. And you'll see, your next door neighbor getting riled up into this fervor of all these crazy conspiracy theories, just as if they were living in a Jonestown. So that's take a moment to express here as well. There's another major misconception about cults that is not described in this definition, is that there is always a single authoritarian leader. That's not the case. That is a common form of cults, but that's a centralized cult, but there are also decentralized cults. And if we think that it can only be with a single leader, then we miss the opportunity to recognize a lot of these other destructive organizations. Again, cults are not defined by a single leader, by religion, by living together, by having weird beliefs. They're defined by psychologically manipulative tactics. That can be applied by a single leader, but it can be applied by a group of leaders. That's the plural. The group that I grew up with, there was a hierarchy, a pyramid, you might say. Back to the MLM idea of there was a leader, and there was a group of 14 other leaders underneath him, and then a bunch of other leaders. The Jehovah's Witnesses have a council of I think 14 men that govern their group. But any group that's authoritarian is going to have a different setup of leaders. You go into communism. Notice I say communism, not socialism. They're different. But you go into communism, it's the rule of all by all, which sounds nice at first, but instead of everyone having their own self-rule, it's the rule of all by all. You have to do what the average person says you can do, rather than having that individuality. And so that's its own kind of tyranny. You can actually, there's a spectrum of authoritarianism even within democracy. So it's a myth that only cults that cults have to always be arranged around a single authoritarian leader. Rather, it's the leadership of cults is authoritarian. The number of leaders doesn't matter. So this last part of the definition, a cult is a religious group often living together whose beliefs are considered extreme or strange by many people. Just because a lot of people believe it doesn't make it so. That's just saying anybody who's different is in a cult. That's not the case. You can have weird and wacko beliefs and not be in a cult. You can, now cults often tend to have strange beliefs that are disconnected from reality, and that's a sign that people are being controlled. But it's not a case of if one, then the other. You can believe that there are aliens on the moon who manufacture the cheese, and then they send it down to Earth to be redistributed by the various pizza companies here. That's a weird belief. On its own, though, is there anything psychologically coercive about that? Is that going to change the way that you live your life? Is that going to change the way that you treat other people? Is that going to change the things that you feel like you're allowed to do? If not, then it's not psychologically coercive. It's not a cult. But that same belief could be applied to psychological coercion. Just going to spitball and get weird right now. So let's say that you believe, I'm just making this up on the spot, okay? So you believe that there's aliens on the moon who make the cheese and send it down to Earth, and therefore there are poisons in the cheese that are only going to affect people of your particular religion, or they're going to keep people from joining your particular religion. Therefore, you need to prevent people from eating cheese. And you've got this whole system of belief built around how you need to control people because of this thing that you believe. Then that becomes more cult-like. So just because it's weird or odd or different doesn't make it a cult. It's when it is psychologically manipulative that is a cult. So to recap, a cult, plain and simple, is a psychologically manipulative group. There's lots of ways to describe it, but it's a myth that there's no academic consensus. I would recommend looking at the different academic models of cults. Things like, I mentioned earlier, Lifton's 8 criteria that he described based on Chinese thought reform techniques. There's the BITE model developed by Dr. Stephen Hassan, who escaped from the cult of Sun Myung Moon, the Unification Church, or the Moonies. He developed the BITE model. That's an acronym. I would highly recommend studying that. Dr. Hassan also developed the influence continuum that shows how all of these attributes happen on a spectrum. There are greater and lesser degrees. I'm sorry, I've got issues with my throat at the moment. So, highly recommend studying those models. Maybe finding some others. Those are different models. Again, it is a myth that cults have to be religious. They can be any group that exercises psychological coercion. It's a myth that all cults live together. Some do, not all do. It's a myth that because a group's beliefs are strange, that makes them a cult. That's not what makes it a cult. Cults are defined by control. Leave you kind of just with this last thought. If I were to sum what a cult is into a single word or term, it's brainjacking. Very simple. Someone taking control of other people's brains, whether it's in a religion, whether it's in a company, whether it's in a political group or country, whether it is in a single a family relationship, or even a single one-on-one romantic relationship. Cults are defined by control. So that was a long way of explaining that, but I hope that it was clear. This is information that's important to share and to get out. I personally believe that cults are, the main bottleneck towards human progress today. It's cult-like or tribal thinking. You could also call it tribalization. It's the main reason that we fight with each other. It's the main reason that different groups of people hate each other. It's the main reason that people prevent progress in things like, taking care of our environment. These tribes are built up that are immune to reality and pitted against each other by the mental illness of that cult coercion. I genuinely believe that that people are fundamentally good, and that if free to think for themselves, that they'll seek to do the right thing. We've got so many problems in this world, and I would submit that the vast majority of people are largely not free to think for themselves because they don't have the tools, they don't have the ability to recognize psychological coercion. And that's what this channel is about, and that's what FLYT is about, freedom to liberate your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I would urge you to share. I would urge you to study for yourself from other resources, particularly academic resources, peer-reviewed sources. Learn and what you can, share with others. Share this video with others if you found it valuable. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I wish you and yours happiness and freedom. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.